Hi, I'm Daryl Lancaster for Threads Magazine. I'm going to talk now about grain lines and their relationship to stay stitching. I am a firm believer in stay stitching. I stay stitch everything. It is a term that we might remember if we learned to sew back in the 1960s, but it has fallen by the wayside as we begin to simplify pattern directions and the steps that newer sewers might take in order to create a garment. There is a really important reason why we stay stitched, and I want to talk about that now. This is a piece of fabric cut from the bolt from a local fabric store. It's a silk woven fabric, and that's really the key here. Because I weave, I understand how cloth is created, and it is that relationship to what happens in the cutout garment that's the most important thing. So here we have a piece of fabric. It has a fold here and two selvages here. When the fabric was actually woven, the selvages would have been parallel to each other at opposite sides. The warp threads, which are the threads that the loom holds tight, they would have been placed in the loom. They run the lengthwise of the fabric. In sewing, we call that the lengthwise grain, but it's really synonymous with the warp of the fabric. The shuttle thread that would go back and forth from selvage to selvage would run in this direction, and in sewing we call that the crosswise grain. The two of those grain lines, the warp and the weft, the crosswise and the lengthwise grain, in all cases should be at right angles to each other. And that's an important thing, that the weft is at right angles to the warp. You don't want any skew in your fabric when you're cutting out your fabric. The difficulty comes when that crosswise grain, which is stable, and lengthwise grain, which is stable, are no longer at right angles to each other. When we have a pattern piece and the grain line of the pattern piece is laid on parallel to a warp thread, you can see that there are a number of edges here that are not parallel or perpendicular to a warp or a weft thread. And therein lies the problem, because in any given woven fabric, any angle that is off of that 90-degree warp or weft intersection is actually subject to give. The actual 45-degree angle bisection of that 90-degree warp and weft is called the true bias, and there is a lot of give there. So any angle of the pattern that we cut out that is not parallel to a warp or a weft can be skewed in the garment construction process. So let's talk about what stay stitching is. So I have little quarter scale bodice fronts and back and a skirt. And again, you can clearly see that these parts here are not parallel or perpendicular to a warp thread or a weft thread. Most importantly, all garments should be stay stitched at the neckline and at the shoulder, and then depending on the angle of a side seam, you might want to address that as well. Now, the direction that we stitch is the most important, and I'm going to show you in a minute why that's really important. Here, I'm going to be starting from the wider point, and I'm going to be stitching towards the center back. Over here, I want to be starting at the higher point, stitching higher to lower, and I'm going to stitch across the shoulder to the armhole. So there's a few rules of thumb. First of all, when I take a garment and cut it out, when I remove the pattern, the first thing that I do after I transfer my marks is I stay stitch. If you have a 5/8 inch seam allowance, it would be done a 1/2 inch from the cut edge. The reason is that what we're trying to do is stabilize the seam line. When we stabilize the seam line, you want to stitch close to the seam line without stitching on top, because this is permanent stitching. And if you stitched on top, you know it's going to show at the end when you put your facings or companion pieces together. So we're going to be stitching with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, a 1/2 inch from the cut edge, which would put us an 1/8 inch just inside the seam line. And we use normal stitches. We want this to be stable, so whatever your preferred normal stitching is what we're going to select. In addition, there is no reason to backstitch because you're not holding anything together. On the side seam here, this particular bodice has an angle that goes down into the waistline. As it lines up on the table, this would be your warp thread. You would stitch wider to narrower. This skirt, which is a pencil skirt, has a little bit of an angle here, but this is fairly straight as it goes down your warp thread. It would lay on the fabric this way. So if anything, what you should stabilize would be here, starting from about the hip and moving towards the waistline. Now I would like to explain why the direction matters. This is a bodice, and I have actually constructed some of the bodice. I've already done the stay stitching, but it's a really good example of why we pay attention to the direction that we're sewing. So the rules of thumb are widest to narrowest and highest to lowest. This neckline here is very subject to distortion in the sewing process, so we really want to stay stitch that angle. This line here is actually parallel to a warp thread, so that's not an issue. The shoulder is clearly off grain, and so we want to address that as well. When you stitch something in the sewing machine, it's just a general understanding of how the mechanism works. There's a presser foot that is applying pressure. And the spongier the fabric, the more this is a big deal. So I'm going to simulate with my finger the pressure of the presser foot as it moves along. Now if I start where the fabric is wider and I move towards narrower, what's actually happening here from a physics point of view is that I'm dropping off warp threads, and they are happily falling by the wayside under the pressure of the presser foot. When I get to the top, it's pretty unremarkable, and you may wonder what the big deal is. When I apply that same pressure and I work from the narrower part of the fabric to the wider part, as I begin to draw down the garment, I'm actually trying to pick up warp threads, which are not going easily under the pressure of the presser foot. And you can see that by the time I get down to the bottom of this neckline, where I move into the straight of grain, I have now added about 3/4 of an inch of extra length. And this is why often you'll see, after you've constructed a garment with this type of neckline, that the two fronts are not even. You stand in front of the mirror and go, how did that happen? Largely because if you stitched up one side and then went around the neck and stitched down the other side, you have added length to the side that was stitched against the grain. I've cut out this blouse pattern, a front and a back, to further illustrate stay stitching. So I have cut the pattern out and I have transferred all my marks with little thread tacks. The back of the pattern, I have actually stay stitched the neck edge. You can see here I have stay stitched a 1/2 inch from the cutting line, doing a small jog for the yet unstitched dart, and I stitched on the 1/2 inch from the cutting line, widest to narrowest, or in this case highest to lowest. The plaid helps you see the grain lines, so that would be my weft or shuttle thread, and this part is higher than this part. So here I'm stitching, jogging for the dart, staying on that 1/2 inch mark, and ending at the shoulder. The neckline, I'm going to, again, if you look at the weft line, this part is higher than this part. So I'm going to start at the shoulder and I'm going to end at the center back. Likewise here, I'm going to, with normal stitches, There's no reason to backstitch, and I'm going to stitch from the high point to the middle of the back. And then this side, I would stitch from the neckline with the jog at the dart to the armhole or armscye. Now this bodice front, I have actually not stay stitched. I have cut it out. I have transferred all of my thread tacks, my markings with thread tacks, and in this case, each of the individual pieces, I will be stitching from the neckline to the armhole and from the neckline down and around to the center front. Now, the angle on the side seam of this particular blouse, you'll notice is fairly steep, and I will most likely also stay stitch the side seam here, at least up to the point where it straightens out. Now, while I'm talking about stitching the side seam, stay stitching the side seam, I also want to talk about directional stitching. This is really important because when I go to join my shoulders of my back to my front, I'm going to pin the shoulders together. I want to stitch in that same direction, shoulder to armhole, highest to lowest. And I want to stitch my side seam in the direction that the grain goes, which is from the hem, in this case, to the underarm. This is a basic A-line skirt. And because we're talking about directional stitching, I want to make it very clear what we're stitching here when we go to put the fronts and the backs together. And so if you start at the wider point, which in this case is the hem, and then you move towards the waistline, when you stitch this side together, you'll be stitching this direction. And then whatever you do to one half of the body, you have to match with the other. So we're going to start over here and we're going to stitch from the hem and we're going to move to the waistline. If we bring the blouse back in that I just showed, again, the side seam is much wider at the hip than it is at the underarm. So I would be stitching the two sides together from the hem to the underarm. So just to recap, how important it is to pay attention to the direction that you're stitching and to make sure that you stay stitch all edges that are subject to give. Let's just look at these two little samples. And I try to explain grain line when you have an angle that is not parallel to the warp or the weft. This is clearly not parallel to the warp or the weft. So when you want to stitch with the grain, that means you're dropping off warp threads and you're following along all of those ends lay down smooth. Think about stroking a cat. Your cat comes up by your leg and you stroke from the head to the tail. The cat nuzzles your leg and all is well. If you were to stitch from the narrow part to the widest part, not only will you distort your edge, but you will raise the grain. So if you were to stroke your cat from the tail to the head, the cat will probably bite you. I'm Daryl Lancaster for Threads Magazine. Thanks for watching.